Good evening, everybody. My name is Tennille Murray. I'm the Political Affairs Director at the Australian Jewish Association. Welcome back to our AJ Weekly Speaker Series. Tonight we're joined by Jonathan Harounoff, Israel's international spokesperson at the United Nations, and one of the most compelling voices explaining the intersection of Iran, Israel, and the global stage. Jonathan is a British-born writer of Persian descent, and he is the author of Unveiled, Inside Iran's Women's Life Freedom Revolt. Jonathan brings rare insight into both the Iranian protest movement and the diplomatic battles playing out at the UN. His work has appeared across major international outlets, including Bloomberg, Newsweek, BBC, and Fox News. Jonathan, we thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to have you. And I'll remind everyone this is recorded and will be replayed on J-Air tomorrow. And a welcome to everyone who's on our YouTube, Facebook, live here. If you have any questions for Jonathan, please use the raise hand button and we'll get to your questions later in the session. Now I'd like to welcome to interview Jonathan, our CEO, Robert Gregory.
Thank you to Neil, and thank you for joining us, Jonathan, at this very, very early hour for you in New York. I just want to start by maybe you could tell us a bit briefly about your background and about what your role is. What is the role of Israel's international spokesman at the UN?
Absolutely. And first of all, good evening to you all, and thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for all the work you're doing to Neil, Robert, and the rest of the AJA team. My name is Jonathan Harounoff. I'm born and raised in London to an Israeli mother, British father, and Iranian grandparents and great-grandparents. And I've been in the United States for the past 10 years. First to study at graduate school with my now wife, who's also from the UK, and to stay for work in corporate communications, media, journalism, and most recently at the Israeli mission to the United Nations, where I serve as the international spokesperson. And essentially what the international spokesperson is in charge of media relations with journalists, editors, producers, bookers, anyone who's covering or writing about Israel related within the framework of the United Nations. I'm in regular contact with. So that involves doing press conferences, interviews, making sure that Israel's narrative is being reflected. Sometimes it isn't, and that's when we have to cultivate media relations, and sometimes it is, but it's done so in a very inaccurate or distorted fashion. So it's essentially like a press secretary, what Caroline Levitt is to the White House, but I guess a bit less glamorous. But it's something that I've had the honor and privilege of doing for the past 2 years, serving under the Israeli ambassador, Danny Danon, who's the first ambassador to return for a second term at the United Nations, which is not something people do very regularly, come back to the lion's den. But it's been an honor of a lifetime, and especially this past 2 years where one thing we've done a tremendous amount of, especially in the earlier year of my tenure, is use the platform that we have at the United Nations to elevate voices that were being ignored at the United Nations, such as the voices of recently released hostages or families of hostages. So we would bring them to the United Nations, to the Security Council, to the General Assembly, and to look into the eyes of all of the ambassadors and the world, and to allow them to speak and tell their story. And more recently, what we've been doing is, since thank God all the, of course, hostages have returned home, and that war is over, is we've been using our platform and our seat at the table at the United Nations to advance other causes, especially since December of 2025, where brave Iranian people have been protesting for so long, and as an extension of their 47-year fight for freedom, is we've been connecting with brave Iranian voices across the world and trying to give them a platform. And only this week, we marked International Women's Day, and I had the distinct honor, and it was almost a full circle moment to bring to the UN a number of women that I had actually interviewed 4 years ago for various publications of for my book, and we brought them to the UN to share their stories, their harrowing stories living under the Islamic Republic, and those voices included Rahele Amini, who who is a psychologist from the city of Kerman in Iran, and she was shot in the eye during the Woman Life Freedom protest movement, where she was attending daily protests in November of 2022. And like thousands of other women, she was shot in the eye, silent, attempted to silence her, but that only intensified her defiance. And she came to the UN to share her incredible story alongside another incredible woman whose name is Shiva Amini, who is a former professional futsal player. She played for Iran's national team, and she was photographed one time playing in Switzerland, I believe, with her hair uncovered. And she and her family started receiving very serious death threats, harassment by the regime. She was forced to leave the country, abandon her professional career, and now she lives abroad where she's coaching and raising awareness about the politicization of sport in Iran. And what we did was we had an incredible panel about life under the regime, for how women across the Iran have suffered, and it was an incredible event. And that's just a sort of a glimpse into the kind of work that we're doing, Robert, out at the UN. There are constant calls, and I'm constantly not being asked, but usually told by people like, why is Israel still at the UN? This is an institution that appears, not to have its focus in the right place. It seems to be myopically focused on the demonization and delegitimization and isolation of the state of Israel. Uh, and it doesn't seem to have its priorities in check. There are times, when the United Nations doesn't feel like an institution with 193 member states, but with one member state, Israel, because of all the focus on it. But my response is that I think we can do much more good, have a much greater impact from within if we have a seat at the table, as opposed to exiting, perhaps having some kind of short-term impact. And then any kind of critique we give of the United Nations, holding them to account from the outside, is going to be much more limited in effectiveness. And we are using our platform, our seat at the table from within, to push our own agenda, highlight the injustices that are being ignored at the UN, and while the UN is the premier avenue for global diplomacy, and while it still has an enormous platform, which it still does, despite its flaws, we want to see at the table. We want to use our spot at the table to highlight the things that are being ignored.
And you touched on a bit the war in Iran and your response in Israel's delegation at the UN's response to it. Could you maybe, because I mean, to me, usually every time there's a war involving Israel, the UN gets very involved, especially the Security Council. I haven't heard too much at all, I guess because the US is involved, but has the war been a major factor at the UN?
So when before the war, we'll just go quickly to the protests in Iran. When the protests broke out in December 2025, it took the United Nations 3 weeks to process any kind of response, official response. And that response was a tepid one. The response was the Secretary General's spokesperson issued a statement on his behalf, stating that the Secretary General was shocked to hear what was happening in Iran. It took 3 weeks to process that kind of shock. And there was an emergency Security Council session convened 3 weeks after the protests were already all over the place. Um, Whenever there's any kind of major development involving Israel, the United Nations acts extremely rapidly. You can expect within hours some kind of statement of condemnation. An urgent Security Council General Assembly or press statement um, issued. But there seem to be multiple realities when it comes to the UN, depending on the topic. But when the war broke out uh, a week and a bit ago, um, there wasn't the immediate response was there was an emergency because it happened my in New York it happened Friday night, late Friday night, which I don't exactly know when that is in Australia, but later. Um, and um, there was an urgent, almost unprecedented Security Council session convened on a Saturday. But you would have expected the content of that Security Council session to consist of member states and the UN institution and senior officials um, applauding the necessity of such an action. But instead, it consisted of most countries condemning Israel and the United States for inflaming, for instigating, for provoking, and even the Secretary General was very critical of the action. So whenever the United Nations does act, it does seem to act in the wrong way. And it's but since then it hasn't been doing a tremendous amount as it concerns the situation in Iran. It was very quick to condemn Israel and the United States, um, but it hasn't we haven't seen too much since.
And one of the things, probably the most common criticism of Israel we hear from particularly diaspora Jewry is that it doesn't have an overarching public relations strategy, that it's not doing Hasbara well. Do you think there's any truth in that claim, or from the inside, do you see things differently?
I think there are always significant opportunities for improvement. I think there are, and we do have our, shortcomings, and especially in a increasingly digitalized social media age where you're up against, images and reels and 3-second videos that are really designed to outrage you. And so you've got a lot on your plate in order to, if you want to just respond with clear-cut facts as to what happened, any situation that happened, you're up against, it's a very uphill battle where you've got to refute whatever it is that you're refuting in a matter of seconds in a way that is eye-grabbing, compelling, but while also attached to reality. And that's a very tall order in today's age where truth is not as important to most people as just like an aesthetic, something that's meant to provide a dopamine hit. Um, but I do think that there is more that we can do. But I also I think that people who do support, who advocate for Israel in the public domain, don't always get credit for the hard work that they're doing. And there are people who are doing a lot of tremendous work.
Agreed. Um, do you think is there a lot that's different behind the scenes at the UN? So, for example, there's a lot of countries that don't have diplomatic relations with Israel that we would think would be very hostile, but is there maybe better relations behind the scenes, or is everything as it seems?
Everything is certainly not as it seems, and there are two realities at the UN. There's one when the cameras are out, when there's a session happening, um, and you can expect certain countries to state a position that you might expect, and then once the cameras are off, once people are just walking in the corridors, you do expect a different kind of interaction, one that's usually more cordial. Um, and especially now where there are countries that don't necessarily state publicly the kind of support, sympathy that they have for Israel. Um, when you're seeing the Islamic Republic firing indiscriminately across the Gulf and attacking many capitals across the Middle East, you are seeing a sort of warming and understanding of relations that you hadn't seen as much before. Um, But another example was back in September during High Level Week when all of the heads of state, presidents, prime ministers come to the United Nations. It was around the time, and Australia played a very significant role, of course. It was around the time of debates around Palestinian statehood. You had many countries that were seizing the podium the moment that they had to focus on these empty declarations and empty statements that weren't really going anywhere. But then at the same time, you had other countries that were perhaps behind the scenes, behind away from the limelight, actually trying to conduct and engage in real diplomacy and engagement, and that was very refreshing to see. Um, so Robert, there certainly are multiple realities, and what you see on camera is not always reflected off screen, um, for sure.
And well, that makes sense. Yeah. But you mentioned your family background as Iranian Jewish. So how is the community feeling about what's going on in the future, and what are your thoughts on the new supreme leader? Yeah.
What we think about the supreme leader? What was the first question? It
And
cut
in
out a bit.
general, how's the Iranian Jewish community feeling about the future? Or are there any contact with Iranian Jews still there?
Yeah, I'm in regular contact with Iranians inside Iran, not just Jewish, but especially not Jewish and some Jewish people as well. I think there is a combination of cautious trepidation, but also excitement at the beginning of this war. Hopes that this could mark finally a turning point that they've been clamoring for 47 years. But there's also a recognition that the Islamic Republic is, uh, despite all of its how it's been weakened militarily since the 12-day war, it is still a behemoth. And regardless of the extent to which its nuclear program and ballistic missile arsenal and military command infrastructure has been severely depleted, its desire to inflict harm, existential harm on Israel and significant damage on the United States and its allies remains intact. And if anything, after the sorry, I'm seeing a message saying that there are sound issues. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I think it's all good. It must be
Okay.
just that person.
Okay, so following the elimination of the second supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and the installation as supreme leader of his son, the third supreme leader, Moshtaba, um, I don't think that is a cause for celebration or excitement. He's someone who is equally, if not more, ideological and dogmatic, and um, he's a healthier, essentially a healthier version of his father, someone who's been discussed as a potential successor for many years. 4 years ago, when I wrote my book, I spoke about the inevitable succession race that would emerge, and he was one of the top people who had been discussed. Um, so there's an understanding that he's someone who's going to continue to perpetuate the principles and the mission, the foundational mission of the Islamic Republic. There's no intention of reforming it, and we can probably, so long as he's still in power, holding the supreme position, we can expect, and the Iranian people I've spoken to can expect no real change in terms of its ideological direction. But there's certainly a lot of optimism, a lot of hope that the joint operation uh, not Epic Fury and Roaring Lion are designed not just to achieve the certain military objectives of eliminating the nuclear threat, ballistic missile threat, proxy threat, but also unlocking a potential future for the Iranian people that they've been fighting for so long, and that's absolutely crucial, and that it would be a dream to see. It would be a dream for me to fly from Tehran to Tel Aviv the same way some of my family members have done. And even though it seems quite un a crazy thought right now, it's not impossible.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I think there's a lot of people hoping to take that flight, the Tel Aviv to Tehran flight. You mentioned your book. Can you explain the relevance of your book to today, and yeah, where we can buy it, and we can share the link in the chat as well.
Absolutely. The book is called Unveiled Inside Iran's Woman, Life, Freedom, Revolt. I can share a link on the chat afterwards. Um, uh, but I spent 3 years, I was previously a journalist writing for Haaretz and the New York Post and a number of international publications in between that political spectrum. And the idea was to interview Iranians inside Iran and in the diaspora to better understand their experiences under the regime. And the interviews included with people like Shiva Amini, who was at the UN today that I mentioned, but also women who lost their children, whose fathers were kidnapped and eventually executed by the Islamic Republic, artists, musicians, rappers who've been brutalized and tormented by the Islamic Republic, opposition figures who've been trying for decades, figures like the exiled Crown Prince, who've been trying for decades to bring about a new Iran. And the book coincided and was focused on the 2022 to 2023 Woman Life Freedom Zan Zandagi Azadi protest movement that exploded and emerged after the killing of Mahsa Amini. She was arrested, as we all know, by the morality police on September the 13th of 2022, accused of wearing her hijab too loosely. And she was arrested, beaten to a pulp, fell into a coma, and eventually died on September the 16th, 2022. And her death triggered a massive outrage in nationwide protests, international protests, and solidarity vigils all over the world, from Sydney to London and elsewhere. And the book focuses on the origins of that movement and its legacy and its ramifications moving forward. And it talks about, future potential movements like what we're seeing today, and what that could look like. So it's interest in the book has certainly spiked in the past few weeks. Um, and I and it was a real honor to speak to all of those incredible people who've seen the worst of humanity.
I think yeah, it's more relevant now than ever. So we will put the link in the chat, and we'll get maybe we'll read it out as well for those that are watching on other platforms. I think yeah, everyone should read it at this time, get it, and yeah, it's a great book for the moment, and for all moments. But I wanted to ask you at the UN. You're up against a big challenge of a lot of organizations. You've got the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. How much of a concern are these multinational organizations?
It's something we're certainly aware of, and as like the United Nations hasn't always has looked different, has evolved over time the way it looks. So in its earlier years, in the late 40s and 50s, membership was fairly small, and Israel was one of the earlier member states to join the UN. But as the years have gone on, membership has grown significantly. Now there are 193 member states, and included in that, and the vast majority of the countries at the UN are not even democracies, something to recognize. But what has happened over the years is you've seen voting blocs coalesce, including the Arab League and which is why invariably whenever there's a vote at the General Assembly where all 193 member states get a vote and they all have their vote matters means the same amount, whether it's a massive country or a small country, um, you can expect a block of countries to vote against Israel almost always without hesitation. So it's something that we're certainly cognizant of. And one thing we try and do is we're cultivating relationships with countries that perhaps that Israel historically hasn't had a relationship with. We value all kinds of relationships and use diplomacy, and one thing that we just did earlier this year uh, was the Israeli mission invited 30 30 ambassadors from all over the world, from every single continent, from Latin America, Africa, Europe, um, and elsewhere, to join on a trip to Poland and Israel to learn about the horrors of the Holocaust and also the promise of Israeli innovation and tech. And it was an extraordinary trip, and it was an extraordinary opportunity for countries, small island nation countries and other countries, to really bolster their relationship with Israel. And it was one example of great, like, on the ground diplomacy, that could hopefully pay off in future votes or other situations at the UN. But there are also other things, and this is a more informal example. Um, that's something I like playing football a lot, soccer. Um, is the United Nations every year has the UN games, and I'm the captain of Israel's football team. And I'm a big believer in bridge building and having these small conversations that could spark something much greater down the line. And I found last year, when I was playing against teams that you wouldn't really necessarily sit down with, those countries, that on the pitch, where the guard is down, there were a lot of opportunities of engagement, dialogue, mutual understanding that were really quite beneficial, and they even last to this day when we see each other at the UN. Um, but in answer to your original question, Robert, there are certainly a huge chunk of countries that almost always vote in a certain direction, and we're working assiduously to mitigate that. And currently the membership size of the UN is very large. So even if there is a fairly significant voting bloc, there are plenty of other countries as well, um, where there are opportunities to cultivate even greater relationships.
And I think you mentioned the small islands. That's one thing we've noticed here. Unfortunately, Australia was pretty shameful lately at the UN, but some of our neighbors, these smaller nations, Fiji, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, these places, they're very pro-Israel and taking some very positive moves. So is that something you've noticed as well in this region here?
For sure. And it's very interesting, actually, because you have certain major countries, let's say, just use Germany as an example, or France, or the UK, where the whole operation concerning the United Nations is very centralized, and the ambassador or whoever's in charge isn't always, I think it's changed over time, isn't always fully empowered to vote on something however they would like. They're usually given instruction by the capital on what to do, what not to do. Um, so when it comes to a vote, there's only so much you can do in order to persuade or state your case, because the vote is inevitable, the direction of the vote. Whereas with these smaller countries, there is an immense opportunity, because they don't always necessarily, they have more autonomy at the UN, and in terms of what they do, in which direction they vote. And if anything, there's an immense opportunity to cultivate those relationships even more. And that's something that has paid dividends for us, that we value the relationship tremendously, and there are a lot of shared values. And just by cultivating those relationships, giving that recognizing who they are, what they're about, has really paid off. And that's what you're seeing with the small island nations.
Yeah, definitely noticed that. I wanted to ask, do you have anything to do with Hillel Neuer, or is his organization more in
His organization, he's tremendous, and I'm speaking on a panel with him at the JNS conference in April in Jerusalem. Looking forward to that. But he isn't an official, he's not part of the Israeli mission. He's based in Geneva, and he heads a watchdog, an independent watchdog called UN Watch. So we're fully aware of his work, his team's work, their output, their research, and they do a tremendous job at holding the United Nations to account, especially the Human Rights Council, which is also based in Geneva. But it's a separate organization. It's not affiliated with the Israeli mission, but the desire and intent to hold the United Nations to account and to ensure that it's doing the right work in the right way is certainly aligned.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. We might take some questions from our audience. I can see we have a lot of hands raised at the moment. Alan, would you like to kick off, please?
Yeah, thanks to Neil and thanks, Jonathan. Jonathan, about 10 years ago, Edwin Black was trying to convene some sort of alternative to the United Nations based on or favouring democracies rather than just anybody, and it never really got anywhere. And now we're reading that the Board of Peace, President Trump's Board of Peace in Gaza, has got a similar sort of aim of replacing the United Nations, but working from an economic model rather than a political one. So, just wondering, what's your view of the Board of Peace? Do you think it will have any effect at all in Gaza? And then, do you see any role for it in a broader sense as some sort of replacement for the United Nations?
Thanks for the question. There's of course a lot of talk and excitement and anticipation about the Board of Peace. Um, can't predict, just how successful it will be. It's certainly off to a very promising start, and its kickoff meeting was extraordinary. And it was very telling that week, actually, because the day before, Israel's foreign minister and a number of other foreign ministers attended both that Board of Peace meeting, and the day before there was a big Security Council session that was headed by the UK's foreign minister, and they also attended that. But if you just looked at the news coverage of the week and just how much, the Board of Peace got a tremendous amount of coverage and the UN got a lot less. Um, I hope it is successful at reconstruction and rebuilding and heralding a new era in Gaza, one that's geared towards peace and not conflict. But if anything, I think the establishment and continuation of the Board of Peace and the momentum of the Board of Peace will be a wake up, a serious wake up for the UN to actually do what it's doing, do what it's meant to be doing. And I think it's been decades and decades that the UN has sort of been the only major player in this diplomatic sphere, and the fact that there's now the specter of something else could jolt it into gear. So I hope, but I hope it's successful. It's successful at what it does, and I mean there are certainly enough problems in the world for there to be more than one institution dealing with it. So it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. Uh, but it's certainly off to a promising start, and we'll have to see what happens down the line. But um, and it also going to have to see what President Trump does in order to ensure its longevity even after he leaves office. Because right now, of course, there's a tremendous amount of momentum. But suppose somebody else takes his place, whether in Republican or Democrat Party, how do you lay the groundwork for the Board of Peace so that it lives, well beyond any single president's administration?
Thank you, Jonathan. We've got a question here in the chat from Leonard, which is quite good. So it says, is there a way for Israel to retaliate against countries who vote against Israel? For instance, recently Israel declared that intelligence sharing with the UK would stop. Is that come through? And what do you think about this question?
Well, I mean, just insofar as the UN is concerned, we have a very big platform at the UN. So whenever there are particular issues with any country, or there's a statement that's particularly egregious, we have no problem using our platform to hold them to account. So if it's whether it's the UK, who historically a very strong ally of Israel's, or another country that is just or senior official who want to use that moment or the limelight to slam Israel, um, then what we do is we, using facts and our composure and the platform, is we fight back. We have no problem fighting back, um, and holding people to account. But in terms of the specific example of intelligence sharing and all of that, I can't comment on it. Um, but and there may be other actions taken, like in the broader government in Jerusalem. But in terms of the UN, we have, especially now since the Iran war broke out, um, we've held almost daily press conferences, and we use that to hold certain countries and individuals to account. For example, when there was a senior UN official who had tweeted an image of the body bags of Iranians who had been piling up weeks after the protests in December, January, and she had misattributed that to the war, the conflict that has broken out most recently, and she was blaming Israel for that. We called that out, that was an extremely dangerous fallacy to be propagating, and we called her out, and she very quickly amended her statement. And that's just one of them. But when there was another senior UN official who, back in Gaza, claimed that 14,000 babies would die within 48 hours, they would die of starvation, and when that was clearly erroneous, we used our place at the UN and our platform to call that out, and there were clarifications and amendments made. But the damage was severe already because nobody cares about refutations in the media world. People are reading the story as it comes to print, and by the time that the clarification has been issued, it's already all over the world in newspapers and headlines and social media. Um, but we certainly have no problem fighting back when necessary.
Thank you, Jonathan. Might go to Stuart if you'd like to unmute, please.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Terrific. My question is, it's kind of simple, but the question is, has there been a bit of an estimation of the dollar value that would be required to substantially change the reputational war or position of Israel and the Zionists and Jews in the world? I mean, if we look at Australia, it's reasonably certain that the Iranian Revolutionary Guards have been paying to foment unrest and whip up anti-Semitism here. And I assume if it's being done here, it's being done pretty much in many other places in the Western world. And there are a lot of influencers out there who have taken on, especially in the MAGA world, they've taken on anti-Israel positions, and it's quite possible that they're being paid to do so. So the question is, has someone sat down and actually said, well, the cost for us to substantially change the reputational position of the Jewish people and Israel and pro-Israel opinion in the world will be such and such. And then as a estimation be, well, that's simply too much and we can't pay that. It doesn't have as high a priority as all the other requirements to defend physically the Jewish people, because B'ezrat Hashem, when Israel and the US do win this war, um, and hopefully Iran will be substantially weakened and quite possibly there could be regime change in the best circumstances. The question is then that the major issue, I think, is the reputation position of the Jewish people around the world. And we will need to hopefully start to address that. So have people sat down and said, well, actually, the cost is going to be such and such. And then once we work out the cost, we can then look at effective ways to proactively start to attack the issue, because a lot of what we're hearing is a lot of
Okay, I
defensive.
might let
Yeah.
Jonathan take
Anyway,
that one.
that's the basic.
Jonathan?
Uh, okay.
Jonathan, if you want to take that question, please.
Well, thank you, Stuart. Um, I don't know if I think this is an issue that is never going to be, I don't think you can assign, a single numerical value to solving this problem. I think there are always going to be individuals, institutions who, no matter how compelling a media campaign or uh, publicity stint or whatever, They're always going to harbor certain views that are never going to change, and they have no intention of entering any kind of engagement with the idea of ever altering their viewpoint. But I think there is certainly a recognition and there have been actions taken by the Israeli Foreign Ministry to invest more in public diplomacy efforts, which is why there was a large investment made. I believe it was last year at some point, of as much as 100 million shekels, or if not a bit more, of actually figuring out how to improve Israel's public diplomacy in various domains. But I don't think, and I don't agree. I think it just wouldn't work to say that there's like a single numerical sum that would end all of our problems. Some things cannot be solved by PR, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying. And there are certainly the people and the individuals who we should be working towards are those who are not the extremes on either side. They're the ones who are sort of on the fence, who are not exactly sure where they stand on a position, have some kind of influence with whichever network they're in, and they're open to the idea of changing their views. And they don't just live in a kind of echo chamber that is harmful. But that's sort of the way I would characterize it. That there isn't just like a one sum that would solve all of our problems. But I certainly, just back to my original point earlier in this discussion, is there is certainly a lot more we can be doing on the public diplomacy, social media, PR front. But it's, even if we do an even better job, it's not as if the problem's going to go away.
Thank you, Jonathan. Charlotte, please unmute.
Thank you, Janelle. Yeah, I've got a question. Thank you, Jonathan. Have you had any contact with Tusi TV? I seem to get a lot of incredible information from that gentleman and that site. It's, I guess, a bit of a guerrilla site, but he seems to be really well disposed to the Jewish sort of side of things, and seems to have the underground information about what's going on in Iran.
Thank you, Charlotte. He certainly does have a very interesting vantage point, and we're in touch fairly regularly. And I was also on his podcast, on his show in London in August. So we're in contact, and he's a very interesting voice. Absolutely, he's one of many. And in terms of actual news, like more mainstream news organizations that are geared towards Iran, other ones that are very good, that I would highly recommend, that I'm sure many of you are already seeing, is Iran International. They're the biggest anti-government news broadcaster in Iran, and they have a tremendous following, and they have an incredible team of brave journalists in the UK, in the US, and elsewhere. And I think they were really they've been their coverage of the current conflict and the protests, and essentially the past few decades of Iranians rising up and fighting for freedom, has been second to none. And they've done it at great cost. Many of their star journalists have consistently been targets of assassinations and harassment and doxing and other kinds of things. Many of them are close friends, and including a number of them faced assassination attempts in London, where I'm from. And there was one particular story of, there's an incredible journalist, his name is Puria Zarati. He hosts a nightly Farsi language show on Iran International. And about 2 years ago, he was stabbed outside his home in Wimbledon. He recovered, thank God. But he no longer felt safe living in London, because, as one of you mentioned, the fact that the Islamic Republic hires agents in Australia, London, America, and elsewhere. But Puria didn't feel safe living in London, so he moved his show, if anyone can guess, to Israel. He's not Jewish, he lives in Israel, and he broadcasts his show from Israel, where he feels safe. So that's the state of the world we're in. But Iran International is an incredible place if you want to get up-to-date news of what's happening. And they have a show in English, they have broadcasts in English and in Persian. They're big on social media, and their journalists are really quite extraordinary. But Tusi is also very good at what he does.
Thank you, Jonathan. And we here at AJA, we've been interviewed on Iran International on several occasions.
Great.
Please unmute.
Hi, Jonathan. So my question is, how soon can this war end, given Donald Trump's announcement, when Iran's military is basically destroyed, their leadership is basically shattered to a point they had to use a cardboard cutout of the next Ayatollah, and their economy is in ruin, given the fact that the massive inflation has really impacted the Iranians earlier this year?
I saw thanks. I saw President Trump's statement, and I think there were additional statements that the war isn't over and there's a way to go. And even when this phase of the war is over, it's not as if everyone packs up and leaves. There are multiple phases to this conflict, and if the first phase, which is actually weakening the Islamic Republic's military establishment, its nuclear sites, its ballistic missile capabilities, which are all still there to an extent. The next phase would be to actually enabling the people of Iran to take charge of their future and to mobilize. And it's much harder for the people of Iran to do that while they're facing a very dangerous, bloodthirsty, ruthless regime. But once that's been severely weakened, it's a less daunting task. So the conflict may go on still for a bit more. But Israel, the United States also, they're not looking for endless wars. They're not looking for wars without clear objectives. And from the outset, the objectives of this war have been very clear. And they also involve, multiple future phases that include empowering the people of Iran so that they can finally take charge of their future, and even an even more subsequent phase that few people are talking about at this point is not just weakening the Islamic Republic, not just bringing about some kind of sustained change, but also figuring out what comes next. You can't just remove a regime without thinking about what could possibly come next, and the people of Iran will need to decide what kind of future they want. And we also need to think carefully about what the best kind of future is for the Iranian people, but it's ultimately down to them. And you got to recognize that is a real thing to think about, because voids and vacuums, especially in a place like the Middle East, leadership voids and vacuums are extremely dangerous. And if they're left unfilled or not looked at, then something much more nefarious or equally nefarious could take its place.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ruben, please unmute.
Hi, Jonathan. My question is, why is the PA still in the United Nations? It doesn't make sense. They're an Iranian proxy like Hamas and the others. What keeps them there?
It's a good question. They don't have, so their current ambassador has been in place for more or less for around 25 years. Most ambassadors have 4 or 5 year long terms. Why they're still there is a good question. They, during the conflict in Gaza, you would never hear them utter the words Hamas at all. It was almost as if, I know they're separate to the PA, but they they're not totally separate, and they haven't seemed for the past 25 years to do that much positive change at the UN, except for continuing to demonize and push their allies in the UN to demonize Israel. And they don't have a seat. They aren't members of the Security Council, and neither is Israel. But they've had, over the years, sort of proxies on their behalf who have been advocating for them, whether it's Algeria or Pakistan. But they've used certain methods in order to advance their goals. Most recently, their ambassador tried to mount a campaign to run for president of the General Assembly, and that was viewed clearly as a subtle way of eventually being able to get full recognition and full member status at the UN, which could, leads to more damaging things. I don't know, but I mean, in terms of like why they're members, that's not for me to answer. But unfortunately, while they have been holding this non-observer status, they haven't used their platform I would say, to ameliorate the conditions of the Palestinian people or to clamor for any kind of peace with Israel, but instead they focused on just trying to isolate Israel at any given opportunity, and that's sort of been their raison d'etre since day one.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ben, please unmute.
Thanks. I missed the beginning. It might have been answered, but the numbers of that Israel's quoting and that Isaac Herzog quoted in terms of that Iran's killed of its own people. I believe the sort of Iran's acknowledged about 3,500. Amnesty and others have mentioned numbers of about 30,000 through internal reporting. He mentioned a number of 50,000. What numbers is Israel at the UN relying on? Is it helpful to overstate it? Did Isaac Herzog overstate it? And then the other question is if you've got any news about South Africa's potential involvement, including through MTN in the blackout, and any traction potentially coming through about South Africa accepting money from Iran. Just those two questions, if you can answer one or both.
In terms of the number of victims inside Iran, I think just because of the scale of the internet blackouts and the repression and the fact that news is not as accessible there as it is elsewhere in the world, we don't yet know the exact number of victims and who they, all of who they were, but we can be sure that the number is in the tens of thousands and certainly not 3,000. But regardless, 3,000 or 30,000 or 50,000, it hasn't been, I don't think the enormity of that kind of atrocity has been acknowledged enough and addressed enough at places like the UN. As I mentioned before, the catastrophic atrocities that took place then were really did not take priority at the UN. And it's a tragedy, but the numbers we know are enormous. The testimonies are really harrowing, and the numbers that I've heard from Iranian sources inside Iran and experts is that it's much closer to the between 30 to 50,000 mark than it is to 3,000. And January 2026 was by far the bloodiest month in the Islamic Republic's 47-year history. And I think it highlights that even though its military capabilities have been severely hampered, and what you see at times of distress for the Islamic Republic is rather than because it can't retaliate militarily to its enemies in the United States and Israel, is it takes it out on its own people. And when it views its own people as existential threats to the ideological pillars of the Islamic Republic, it will have no problem unleashing an incredibly devastating amount of repression on its own people in order to perpetuate its rule. And I think what we saw in January 2026 was just an example of that, the latest example, but we saw other forms of brutality in 2022 to 2023 where women were being targeted, where women were being shot in the eye, attempted silence. We saw it in 2017 to 19, and it's just part of a much longer thread of the Islamic Republic waging war on its own people. In answer to your second question, I don't have the specific details on South Africa accepting money, so I won't refrain from commenting on it.
Thank you, Jonathan. We'll take our last audience question from Hazel, please. Unmute.
Jonathan, there are some concerns that Russia is currently helping Iran and possibly might even help more actively. I saw Zelensky saying that they were concerned that Russia might even send, soldiers militarily. I'm just wondering, in your dealings with these ambassadors in the UN, what is the behind the doors relationship with Russian ambassadors and possibly even the Chinese who, whenever I've gone to Israel, I've always seen lots of Chinese businessmen and told that there's a lot of trading and dealings between China and Israel. So I'm just wondering, in the United Nations, what your relationship is like with these ambassadors.
Could I just ask a second question, Jonathan? If you were going to arm the Iranian people, how would that be done?
Taking away from my question, go away.
Well, thank you both for your questions. At the UN, there's certainly a recognition that there is a sort of axis, an alliance between Russia, China, and the Islamic Republic, and Russia and China are two of five permanent members in the Security Council, so they hold very tremendous sway alongside the US, France, and the UK. So they do have, and today actually, I guess tomorrow for you guys, is that there are big security there are two actually important Security Council sessions today. The first one is about Lebanon and the conflict going on there and the tensions rising there between Israel and Hezbollah. The second is about a group of Gulf states led by Bahrain, who have put forward a resolution condemning the Islamic Republic of Iran for its aggression in the region. The fact that, it's one thing Israelis running to shelters, unfortunately they're used to it, but it's another thing when Emiratis and Bahrainis and Kuwaitis who aren't used to this kind of thing have to flee to their shelters on a regular, they don't have shelters, to underground car parks and things like that on a very regular basis. And if anything, that's been a source of like mutual sympathy and coming together, even at these difficult times. But I'm saying all of this because there was some talk of Russia potentially, stepping in, attempts to amend the language of the resolution to make it a bit more sympathetic towards the Islamic Republic, or not as strong. But you do see instances of Russia sort of advocating for the Islamic Republic just because it has a much stronger position at the UN. So there's no questioning that at all. But I'm not going to go into even greater specifics, but there's a very clear recognition that there is an alliance there. In terms of the second question, Anthony, I'm not again going to go into specifics about who is arming who and how they're arming them. But yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. But that's just, I think, one component of a much bigger picture, and something that I think the Iranian people don't get enough credit for is you sometimes hear commentary of, why aren't the Iranian people rising up? Like, where have they been for the past 47 years? Why are they propping up this regime? Why are they supporting this regime? Ignoring the fact that throughout the Islamic Republic's history, from day one, Iranian people have been fighting back. Whether if they don't have weapons, they've been extremely creative at using other tools of defiance. So when it comes to women, they've essentially used their hair, their bodies, their dance, their music as very major weapons, and those are weapons and tools of defiance in the eyes of the Islamic Republic. For a regime that is so intently focused on the subjugation of women, the fact and their second-class status, when you've seen women trying to steer away from that, that really poses an existential threat to the regime, which is why they usually respond with crazy amounts of brutality. So, I'm not going to talk about specific weapons, but what you have seen is over the years, Iranian people use different tools at their disposal to rise up. And what we haven't seen is the international community step up to the plate and provide sustained, tangible support for the Iranian people. So sometimes there's a focus, too much of a focus on the Iranian people and what are they doing, but I think we also need a moment of introspection of like, what are we also doing to support the Iranian people in their fight?
Thank you, Jonathan. We are just about out of time, so before we close up for the evening, I'd like to ask you, how do we follow you? How do we purchase your book? And how do we keep in touch with what you're doing?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you all this evening. Happy to, Robert has my email, and if anyone wants to reach out, I'm happy to talk. I'm on all the platforms. And my book is available on, that's right, Kathy, it's available on Audible, and I believe in Australia it's also available on Amazon and a few other places, wherever you guys get your books, but it's certainly available on Amazon and in certain bookstores. And if there are any issues, feel free to reach out. I believe Robert has the link as well. And happy to, I had the incredible, I came to Australia last year for my honeymoon with my wife. And we had the most incredible time in Sydney. We took a cruise up the coast and we got to spend a Shabbat with Mizrahi Synagogue in Bondi Beach. And it's one of the most incredible communities. And my heart goes out to everyone who's been affected by the past few years of anti-Semitism and what happened in Bondi as well. And I'm itching to come back to Australia. So I hope to see some, if not all of you soon in person. But I saw a message about social media. Yes, I'm on social media, and I can send to Robert the specific handles if anyone would like to reach out.
Jonathan, I've popped that link to your book in the chat as well. Your book is called Unveiled. It is available on Amazon, Audible, and if you just type in Jonathan Harounoff on Google, you'll find all his social media links and a lot more information. Jonathan, we would absolutely love to have you back in Australia. I know our audience would love to see you, love to meet you, and to hear more. Simply soak in all the information you have. I think what you've shared with us tonight just scratched the surface on such a deep and incredible topic. But really, we can't tell you how much we appreciate the 4 a.m. wake up to join us here in Australia. It's so special when we have a guest like you, and we want to remind everybody that this is recorded. It'll be available on our YouTube channel, so please do share the recording. There are a lot of great questions in here tonight that the information should be passed on, especially with what we're experiencing right now. Jonathan, again, thank you for your kind words for our community, and thank you for standing strong and being such a incredible force against the UN. We couldn't have thought of anybody better to represent our community and our nation against such hostile environment. So it's such a privilege to have someone like you standing strong against the enemy. Thank you again, and we wish everyone a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.